Well, we've been in Judges and we're continuing there. And we began last week in a new sort of section of narrative with chapter 17. And we met a man named Micah and then a young Levite. And we saw how they weren't living in the roles that God had called Israelites to live in. It creates a big mess. But last week was sort of introductory. It's the beginning. Remember, I used the analogy of a snowball, and this thing's getting bigger as it rolls downhill. And so chapter 18 is in that vein as well. I want to start by saying you can see that the title is Ripple, the cascade of sin into death, and we'll kind of get there toward the end of the sermon. But you've been to ponds and things where you've seen puddles, and you've seen the ripple effect of a drop or a stone in water, and it moves out, right? Yes. Can I get a nod? Let's just be, yeah, okay, good. It helps me. When I ask you in an hour and a half if you're still awake, I'll expect you to nod your head. It's great because I know we have some visitors, and they're like, did he just say an hour and a half? All right. So I was thinking, just my first thought about ripple effects really has to do with, I guess, cause and effect relationships, whether it's in just regular life or relationship. I didn't get into the science-y bit of it, but I did decide, let me just quick look at what some science-y type person might have to say about what's really going on with ripple effects. And I'm not even going to get into it too much, other than to say that one article I read talked about how let's just imagine a smooth-faced body of water, whether it's a puddle or a pond or lake or something like that. The water is at a low-energy state. And when it's interrupted by another blast of energy, whether it's from a stone that we throw in or a stick or something that it could be the wind, all kinds of things can act upon it. Other sources of energy can act upon the surface of the water and create ripples. And it's interesting to me because in the creation of the ripples, it's the water trying to dissipate that energy and get back to a low energy state. I'm not calling water lazy at all. But it's interesting that it has a desired effect, I guess. It has a goal, to personify it a little bit. When we're looking in Judges, and especially, you could really pick any part of the book of Judges, and you could say, ripple effects, and we could name every sermon Ripple or whatever. But I wanted to look at it this morning because that's what I'd like us to focus on, is the ripple effect that people can have, both positive and negative. Now, we're in the book of Judges, so unfortunately, we're dealing with the negative side of the ripple effect. And we're going to look at it and deal it. We can't just turn away from the Bible when it says things that are uncomfortable, especially as we get into these coming chapters. We're going to have to deal with, we're going to read this out loud. We're going to talk about what this is. I'm going to have to deal with that as the speaker. So, ripple effects. So, what we have Micah and a Levite, and we have a tribe of Dan, and all these things are coming into view. And I'd like to begin by just reminding you that what we're seeing are examples of people who they've not understood or cared about what God wanted for them, what God had called them to be, who God had called them to be in their life, how he had called his people to live as he lives. They had ignored that. And it affects others. When you and I fail, when we refuse to live the kind of life that Jesus has exemplified for us, it has an effect. And we've said in previous sermons in this study in Judges that every one of us is a leader of some sort. You may not be leading droves of people, but someone is watching you. You are having an effect on someone's life. And so it matters whether or not we choose to honor God with our lives or honor ourselves. It has an effect. Let's go ahead and get into Judges chapter 18 then, and we'll kind of work through this and come back around and see, have some more consideration as to this ripple effect. So, Judges 18, verse 1, in those days there was no king in Israel, And in those days, the tribe of the people of Dan was seeking for itself an inheritance to dwell in. For until then, no inheritance among the tribes of Israel had fallen to them. I'm going to be stopping periodically throughout this, just so you know that's how we're going to approach it this morning. Because I want to just say, if you're reading this and you're thinking to yourself, okay, well, one, I've heard this before. In those days, there was no king in Israel. That's a deal that's throughout Judges, and it's going to move, the reader moves them on into 1 Samuel. But that there was no king, it gets us back. We go all the way back into Joshua, and it wasn't that there wasn't a king, it's that they had rejected the one who wanted to be their king, Yahweh. And so, all right, interesting. But then there's this comment made, the author is telling us the people of Dan were seeking for itself an inheritance, like they had no space. And you can sort of, like, real quick be like, oh, these poor people, they didn't find a place to live yet. And that's not the case either. In fact, if you were to look back into Joshua chapter 19, verse 40 through 47, I'm going to have it here for you as we move through it. Check out what it says all the way back in Joshua. This is when Joshua was giving the allotments to the tribes of Israel. Verse 40 says, the seventh lot came out of the tribe of the people of Dan, according to their clans, and the territory of its inheritance included Zorah, Eshtaol. That's important because those are the two cities listed in the Judges section that we're looking at. It goes on to Shemesh, Sha'alabin, Ajalon. I did not practice these. Ithla, Elon, Timnah, Ekron, Eteka, Eltekah, Gibbeton, Baalathon, Jehud. I didn't realize there's so many of these cities. Beneberek, Gath Ramon, and I know how I want to say that word, but me jarkin. Okay. And Rakkon, with the territory over against Joppa. Verse 47, I probably just should have just read verse 47. When the territory of the people of Dan was lost to them, they had a territory and they lost it. The people of Dan went up and fought against Lashem. In our text, Lashem is the same as, now I want to say Leah, and I'm not sure that that's correct. Well, it's the same town that we're going to look at in chapter 18, but they took possession of it, settled in it, calling Lashem Dan after the name of Dan, their ancestor. I could have really pared that down, but the point that I was trying to make here is that all the way back in Joshua, they were given an area that they were to go in. And like every other tribe of Israel, God said, I'm bringing you into a good land. Here it is. Here are the borders, and here's your allotment. This tribe, this tribe, this tribe, this tribe. But it was up to them to trust Yahweh, to give them the ability to drive out the wickedness and the people who are in rebellion against Yahweh. They were to trust him to do that. They were to do the fighting. They were to move into that space along with God. And what we're seeing is the problem is that Dan didn't do that, and they allowed other people groups to come and actually push them out even further. And so what we're seeing in this whole chapter 18 business is an effect of them not obeying God to begin with. When they had a clear calling and they had their next steps, and they just figured new. And so rather than do what God called them to do, to be who God called them to be, to trust him in a very palpable way, they decide they've got a better plan. They'll figure things out on their own. So that's a real problem. Rather than act in faith and obedience to Yahweh, these Danites decided to forge a destiny for themselves. Let's look at verse 2. That was verse 1. Let's look at verse 2. So the people of Dan sent 5 able men from the whole number of their tribe, from Zorah and from Eshtaol, to spy out the land and to explore it. And they said to them, go and explore the land. And they came to the hill country of Ephraim, to the house of Micah, and lodged there. Now you see, just quickly, they came to the house of Micah. And now 2 narratives are beginning to collide, or at least become one narrative Micah coming from chapter 17. And so they go, and they're in the mountains of Ephraim. They find Micah's house. They lodge there. Verse 3, when they were by the house of Micah, they recognized the voice of a young Levite. What? So there's a couple things. As these 5 spies go and travel, they're just looking for a good place to live, searching for a place for them. And if you remember, what's interesting is that it's a very similar description that the Levite had in chapter 17. He was going to go and find a place for him. Hey, Micah says, what are you doing out here, Levite guy? And he's like, oh, I'm just looking for a place to be me, y'all. You know, and will come be my priest, just as a refresher there. And so then the 5 spies, they hear his voice, whether they actually knew the guy or whether they just recognized the dialect, because now they're quite a bit a ways from their hometowns. It could be either, but in either case, they recognize that he was from another area, and they have questions. Let's go ahead and continue reading. It says, and they turned aside and said to him, who brought you here? What are you doing in this place? And what is your business here? And he said to them, this is how Micah dealt with me. He has hired me, and I have become his priest. And they said to him, inquire of God, please, that we may know whether the journey on which we are setting out will succeed. And the priest said to them, go in peace. The journey on which you go is under the eye of the Lord. Super ambiguous reply, by the way. And the way that it's written, doesn't it give you the sense like, did you take a minute? Did he inquire of God? Like, what's the sincerity level here? Was there any action on his part? Or is he just kind of speaking out of a title that he's been given, one that he doesn't deserve, he's not supposed to have in terms of being called a priest? But he just kind of gives them this rote positive thing because everybody loves good news. Continuing in verse 7, then the 5 men departed and came to Laish. That was the same as what was mentioned in Joshua. And now I can't remember that thing. If anybody has any ginseng handy, I'll be happy to take some. Might help me remember words. Okay, 5 men departed and came to Laish and saw the people who were there, how they lived in security, after the manner of the Sidonians, quiet and unsuspecting, lacking nothing that is in the earth and possessing wealth, and how they were far from the Sidonians and had no dealings with anyone. And when they came to their brothers at Zorah and Eshtaol, so now they've spied these people who are living the good life in a good place, but they don't have any clear ties, or they're not close enough to anybody that can protect them. They're ripe for the picking. So these 5 guys go back home to Zorah and Eshtaol. Their brother said to them, what do you report? And they said, arise and let us go up against them, for we've seen the land, and behold, it is very good. Will you do nothing? Do not be slow to go, to enter in and possess the land. As soon as you go, you will come to an unsuspecting people. The land is spacious, for God has given it into your hands, a place where there is no lack of anything that is in the earth. Sounds good, doesn't it? So 600 men of the tribe of Dan, armed with weapons of war, set out from Zorah and Eshtaol, and went up and encamped at Kiriath Jearim in Judah. Let's just pause. We established already that the tribe of Dan had been given an allotment of land, but they didn't trust Yahweh, and so they were afraid to fight for the land that was given to them by God himself, and that's a problem. And so they go out, and they are willing now to fight against a people who have no weapons or ties to a larger army. I mean, what a word that comes to mind is cowards. Bullies. And so they take 600 men out of a people who were already established in a place, in these 2 cities, that were part of their overall allotment. Now, here's what's interesting. In the book of Numbers, we're giving, our census is taken, how many people are in Israel. And in Numbers chapter 26, verse 43, this one census, ascribes a total number of 64,400 males to the tribe of Dan. And what we're looking at is first they send out 5 dudes, and then they come back, and now they're getting 600 armed people. And we're going to see in a little bit in the future yet that they're going to take women and children with them. But the question is this just one part of the bigger whole, or is this the whole tribe of Dan? And it's probably a smaller part. And that matters in regard to this idea of ripple effect, because again, if we can keep our eye on the dot, this particular set of chapters, this narrative section starts out with a woman with a son named Micah who stole some money from her and returned it. And then an image of God was made, and then this Levite shows up, and then he hires him as a priest. And then the Danites say, oh, hey, look, we've come along, and now you see 5 guys, and then there's 600 guys. And can you begin to see the pattern of a ripple effect of people's bad behavior? But what's interesting is that they're all cool with it. And one thing that I'd like you to pay attention to as we move through is the reason I believe they're all cool with doing things that are outside of what God called them to do, they're being disobedient, is because they're affirming one another's human nature. All of them are after really what suits them the best or what they think is good for them, and it's not. And so it's not hard to convince other people to act like humans. You know what I'm saying? And I don't mean humans in the positive sense. Because of our sinfulness, it's easy to get people to go along, or it's easy for us to be brought along to other people that are doing things that appeal to our flesh. And that's all that's happening here. And that's why nobody's putting on the brakes and nobody's asking the hard questions. They're asking questions, but they're actually the wrong people asking the wrong questions. So we have this group of Danites now who's going to be on the move. So we continue to read. It says, on this account, that place is called Mahaneh Dan to this day. Behold, it is west of Kiriath Jearim. And they passed on from there to the hill country of Ephraim and came to the house of Micah. Now, first was the 5. They showed up, and they're like, my guy, you sound familiar, and what are you doing here? And Levites aren't supposed. You're not really a priestly Levite. You're just like another of the Levites, but you're doing priestly things. And let's just think for a minute about what kind of fella this Levite is. We'll actually get a name and a lineage from him later. But his reply, right, you recall, oh, well, I showed up here, and this guy Micah said he'd pay me to be a priest. And so first, this Levite, he's looking for a life for himself, because somehow the life that God had called him to wasn't good enough. And so then when he goes out and randomly runs into Micah's household, now this is probably a rich household, he's good to become something that he's never intended to be for money. I mean, we can work on that. The temptation for people to, sell out or miss a calling, miss the bigger picture that God has for their life on account of money is a story as old as time itself. And so when the 5 Danites come, they're going to take the 5 spies are going to take the larger group back through the same way they came. And they come to this house again, and this ripple effect keeps unfolding. So in verse 14, then the 5 men who had gone out to scout out the country of Laish said to their brothers, do you know that in these houses there are an ephod, household gods, a carved image, and a metal image? Now, therefore, consider what you will do. What kind of question is that? I think it's more of I got an idea. What if we had one of these for ourselves? Let's keep reading, verse 15. And they turned aside there and came to the house of the young Levite at the home of Micah and asked him about his welfare. Now the 600 men of the Danites, armed with their weapons of war, stood by the entrance of the gate. Just kind of imagine that, would you, for a minute? You've got a gate, you've got a house. We find later in the text that there are houses, all part of this Micah's group. his family clan. And outside the gate, there's 600 men with weapons. Verse 17, and the 5 men who had gone out to scout out the land went up and entered and took the carved image, the ephod, the household gods, and the metal image, while the priest stood by the entrance of the gate with the 600 men armed with weapons of war. So the idea is, if we want our trek, our journey, what they intend to do, conquer of this land and this pocket of Sidonian people, we should take these religious implements, because really, right, they're good luck charms. This is where the power comes from, the trinkets. And that's what they do. So they just walk in, they grab them. Verse 18, and when these went into Micah's house and took the carved image, the ephod, the household, I'll slow down, the ephod, the household gods, the metal image, and the metal image, the priest said to them, what are you doing? And they said to him, this is great, keep quiet. Put your hand on your mouth and come with us, and be to us a father and a priest. Is it better for you to be a priest to the house of one man, or to be the priest, or to be priest to a tribe and clan in Israel? And the priest's heart was glad, because he's going to be somebody, right? Oh, we're talking about fame and fortune. People are going to look to me by the hundreds, perhaps by the thousands. People were going to be looking to me. Verse 21, so they turned and departed, putting the little ones and the livestock and the goods in front of them. When they had gone a distance from the home of Micah, the men who were in the houses near Micah's house were called out, and they overtook the people of Dan. And they shouted to the people of Dan, who turned around and said to Micah, what is the matter with you that you come with such a company? If you're imagining this the way I'm imagining it, they go into the guy's house, they steal his stuff, they take his priest, even though it's all messed up. Everything is all just ungodly, it's messed up. But they take his stuff, and they just walk off. And when Micah realizes, he gathers his clan together and he goes after him. Hey, give me my stuff back. And the question they ask is funny. Like, what's the matter with you? What do you mean? Work with me here on a comical level. What do you mean, what's the matter with me? You just took my stuff. What's the matter with you that you come with such a company? And he said, you take my gods. That's hilarious. If your gods are that portable and needs to be so easily swept away, taken away, perhaps they're not really big G gods. Anyway, getting back to this, he said, you take my gods that I made, and the priest, and go away, and what have I left? How then do you ask me, what is the matter with you? And the people of Dan said to him, do not let your voice be heard among us, lest angry fellows fall upon you, and you lose your life with the lives of your household. Then the people of Dan went their way, and when Micah saw that they were too strong for him, he turned and went back to his home. Man, we could camp on that just for humor's sake, but that's not our point this morning. Verse 27, but the people of Dan took what Micah had made, and the priest who belonged to him, and they came to Laish. You see, in that, it's messed up. It's all messed up. All of this is messed up. It doesn't match anything about the law that God had given his people. None of it's congruent. It's all very Canaanite-ish. And so they came to Laish, to a people quiet and unsuspecting, and struck them with the edge of the sword, and burned the city with fire. And there was no deliverer, because it was far from Sidon. And they had no dealings with anyone. It was in the valley that belongs to Beth Rehob. Then they rebuilt the city and lived in it. And they named the city Dan, after the name of Dan, their ancestor, who was born to Israel. But the name of the city was Laish at the first. And the people of Dan set up the carved images for themselves. And Jonathan, the son of Gershom, son of Moses, and his sons were priests to the tribe of the Danites until the day of the captivity of the land. So they set up Micah's carved image that he made as long as the house of God was at Shiloh. So much is being said in these verses. I'll ask the media folks. There was a slide that had a map. I just want to give you an idea of where all this is going down because we're going to talk about it. I don't know, it's maybe the third or fourth slide, guys, if you could show that map. Yeah. Down the bottom is where Zorah and Eshtaol is, and that tannish area is the area that they were allotted by Joshua. They know Likey because they disobeyed and they were getting crowded out. So they travel all the way up. Yep, and right about where that cursor is, you can see that we're in the mountains of Ephraim, and they go all the way up to the top. That's very near the border of the land that God had given his people. And when we talk about ripple effect, that becomes really important. First off, I want to point out, maybe just working out of order, but it talks in verse 31 about the idea that they set up Micah's carved images that he made, or his carved image that he made, and they set it up. And there's a phrase that says, as long as the house of God was at Shiloh. You can see Shiloh, it's the little dot down there. The picture's not that important. But for quite a while, for during this period of time, that was the place of worship for the tribes. That's where the tabernacle was set up. That's where the priests would have functioned. And the tribes were to go to there for the feasts and the things of that nature. But now they've taken their own bit and they've gone far north. And that becomes another ripple effect. Some of you, if we back up and look at verse 30, I said earlier, we're going to find out who this Levite is. We get a little bit of lineage about him. And it says that he is the son, his name is Jonathan, the son of Gershom, son of Moses. Now, some of you may have translations that say he's the son of Manasseh. That's an interesting little bit right there. But in the oldest manuscripts, it's Moses. And there's a reason why they think that some of the later manuscripts use Manasseh, and that's something we can discuss in the afters. But it's the son of Moses, and his sons were priests to the tribe of the Danites. Moses' sons were never to be priests. Aaron's sons were to be priests. And the whole thing remains and continued to have a ripple effect that was against or outside of what God had set up for them. They go into this town. Now, this city, we back up a little further, Laish, that they renamed Dan, becomes interesting again if we're thinking about the ripple effects. Because the place they choose, that place way up north, that green, lush valley was filled with riches and good land and was a safe place, was that way because it was well watered. The water came from a spring that was located in the city, and also from snow runoff from a very large mountain just a bit of ways away. And some of you will remember a sermon series that included a study on Mount Hermon. And it is also called Baal Hermon, which essentially means the place of worship, or the worship of Baal, the place of the worship of Baal. I might have the words mixed up. But this was the mountain that ancient Near East cultures believed the god Baal ruled over, and that the reason that it was such a, not culturally diverse, environmentally diverse mountain was because the god Baal resided there, and every spring was the resurrection of Baal and his blessings coming out in that area. At the base, now if you don't remember that, I'll give you another hint as to what we're very near. The base of that is a large gaping hole out of which a spring rises. It eventually becomes known as Caesarea Philippi. It's known in the ancient times as the gates of Hades, a place where the spirits, the gods, would move in between realms. And off to the side of that, for thousands of years, looking into that opening, I didn't bring pictures of that, is a temple to Pan. And the worship to Pan. We talked about all this. And this is where Jesus took his disciples and said that he's going to build his church upon the rock, and the gates of Hades will not prepare against it. He went to the most pagan area and called, some of you recall the message, he calls out the evil forces and says, bring it on, and he picks a fight. But this is the area that this is happening. Now, if you think contextually, we're talking this, what do you call things where the water comes out that I just said? Thank you. The spring that comes out of there joins with the spring that comes out of Dan, and also another spring converge to become the River Jordan. Now that's just a fun fact. But all the greenery comes from that. Religiously speaking, however, this place becomes known for its wickedness. If we were to do ripple effects, and we move from the chronology or the time frame of the Judges, and by the way, if I can speak to that just for a second, what's happening here in verses 17, 18, and 19 chronologically fits in the beginning of the book of Judges. So early on in the conquest, Israel's meant to be conquest of the promised land. That's when this is occurring, most believe. So to the north then, if you were to fast forward hundreds of years, we get to the first king of the northern kingdom. By now, King Saul, King David, King Solomon have all come and gone, and there's a split in Israel, north and south. The first northern king is named Jeroboam. He not only is a wicked king, he picks up on the ripple effects that go all the way back to a man named Micah in the book of Judges. And I've got two pictures, I think, of what Jeroboam builds. You can see this today. This is a site that they've excavated in the city of Dan. And this is where Jeroboam, this is in the Bible, Jeroboam built a copy of the temple so that his constituents, the other tribes, the other northern tribes, wouldn't have to go down to Jerusalem to worship. Because if they went down to the southern kingdom, then there could be some swaying of allegiance, and he was not into having his northern kingdom disrupted. And so he makes a copy, and he moves the feast days. He perverts the entire thing. And what he does is take this place, this is an altar, and by the way, there's actually things all messed up about his altar. And then there's a second picture. Can you show that one? So if the altar is down to your left, then there is a place, this platform, which was the high place at Dan, which is where a golden calf, Jeroboam sets up a golden calf to be worshipped alongside Yahweh. In the distance, difficult to see, is a mountain, Mount Hermon. Their temple that Jeroboam creates, builds, that has a carved image and that involves worship either to a mixed, perverse version of Yahweh or includes Baal worship alongside Yahwehism. Either way, not great. But it faces Mount Hermon, the mountain where we worship Baal. That to me is dramatic, and it's worth thinking on, like, how do things get so twisted, and how is it that evil is at work in the world, both in the ancient world as well as it is in the postmodern world? But the reason I'm bringing it up to you this morning is because it fits this idea of the ripple effect. This place, this temple, this site, where it faces, like, is connected directly to this unknown guy in chapter 17 of Judges, Micah, and their willingness to Canaanize Yahweh's worship by making a carved image. So he makes it like his mom has it made. He puts it up in his house. He hires a priest who's not priestly. This tribe of Dan comes along. They pick up the priest. They carry him off along with the idol. They go to a city that they overrun because they didn't accept what God had provided for them. And there they establish worship of a carved image. And hundreds of years later, that same ethos, that same religious practice gives birth to an entire perverted copy of a temple where there's a golden calf placed on the high place and worshipped. The end of that particular story narrative is that Yahweh will wash his hands of the wickedness, and the Assyrians will come and carry them off. The northern tribes will be dispersed by the Assyrians, and that is a matter of judgment of Yahweh upon their disobedience and lack of faith. Do you think it's a stretch then? You see the connections? I'm hoping you do, because I'm 100% convinced that this nonsense is directly related to some no-name guy, some thief, who creates a carved image and all of a sudden just tries to syncretize religion to try to come up with something that he likes. Let me do religion my way. I am intrigued by this whole thing, that anyone who seems insignificant, who may see themselves as insignificant, it may be you, it may be me, but that our behavior can cause a ripple effect that can affect people for hundreds of years. It's not just one story in the Bible, it's in fact the entire narrative of Scripture. You can find the ripple effects, whether positive or negative. They're there. The whole thing is a story of humanity, and you're a part of that, and I'm a part of that. There was, of course, another point in history when an enormous ripple effect was caused, but this to the positive. That God himself would come and take on flesh. And that he would enter into this place, and that man, that divine man, Jesus Christ, would stand at the mouth of that very spring and call out all evil to come and try to defeat him. And he said his church would prevail, it would dominate. And the ripple effects of that we are seeing even this morning. So there's a ripple effect from one man who seemed insignificant in the area of Jerusalem, but who came in power and majesty. And we sat in for a half hour, we worshiped him this morning. And the ripple effects of what he has created will continue forever. Unlike the ripple effects of something evil and perverse that God will judge and bring to an end, the ripple effects brought by Jesus Christ and the life that he offers and the forgiveness and the peace will continue on forever to an everlasting kingdom. And so I want to ask you to think about what your part is in the history of the world again. You have been affected by ripple effects. By the way, if you throw 2 stones into a pond, the ripples don't bump into each other and then stop. They overlap, or I don't know what you call it, but they can coexist, which I say coexist. As soon as I say that, I think about the goofy bumper sticker, which is utter trash. I'm not talking about that coexist. I'm just talking about ripples on a pond right now, not a metaphorical thing. But when we do make it a metaphor, we are influenced by positive and negative, by godly and the wicked alike. Only in the case of human beings, we have been given the free will to choose whose ripple effects we will allow to make changes, transformation in our life. And so many of you that I know have allowed Jesus Christ to come and make change, make transformation in your life, and on to a greater existence. I say existence, you've got a purpose, and he's using you. You yourself are a ripple effect. You are as much of an effect as you are a cause in someone else's life. In regard to people who are wicked, and to those like Micah and this false priest, I was drawn to James chapter 1, verses 12 through 15. Like, okay, you have these people, and they're just, maybe someone could argue, they're just trying to make their way. God had so many rules, right? After all, there's over 600 of them in the law of Moses, and they're just trying to figure things out. And it can be tough to move into a new neighborhood and keep your bearings. So maybe we're not so hard on them, but that's a generous view, a generous way to interpret the text. Really what it is a people who rejected. This is a group of people who rejected what God had called them to be and to do. And so I was thinking about James chapter 1. Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, whether it's testing, temptation. For when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted with evil. He himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. And here's the part I'd like you to really camp on for a minute. James continues. He says, then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. In the beginning of the Micah narrative, there was a desire, and it brought forth temptation, and that temptation ends up in death. We don't see it in Micah's personal death, but the temptation to be drawn away by some false sort of religion, by some idea that serves self rather than God, meets its fullness in the judgment brought through Assyria. And James is saying here that on a personal level, it's really no different. We come into desires that match our humanness. Like we have certain needs that we feel should be met, or certain things we want to feel, do. It's pretty, I say plain, but maybe it's not always plain. We know what we want. At least we think we do. We know how we want to feel, and when we're stressed or tempted, we have ways that we'll find satisfaction. And I was thinking about this. These could be small ways. These could be large ways. They probably almost always seem like it doesn't matter. I had an example yesterday, and I'm trying to recall it. It was something so simple. It wasn't necessarily sin, but it was, let me give you a picture of my day yesterday. As you all know, it was gloomy, it was cloudy. I was home with Sawyer. Lauren had gone to the beach. As the day went on, Sawyer hadn't been feeling well. He's not here this morning, and so he's just laying around, and I'm just laying around. I couldn't go anywhere, and I was kind of like, ugh, I'm not doing anything today. I'm not being productive. I don't feel like doing anything, and I had to go to Walmart to pick up some food, because Lauren's at the beach, and apparently she took the food with her. No, she didn't take the food with her, but I guess I'm just saying, pray for me. I have to fend for myself. No. But in that day, it was just a blah day. And I wanted to unblah my day. They're totally playing the music on me. I wanted to unblah my day. And I unblah my day with sweets. Like I said, it doesn't have to be sin necessarily. Amen. But that's just a little picture of what we do when we don't feel like we're where we want to be, who we want to be. We take on these other solutions to satisfy something inside of us that remains dissatisfied. And while they may not be inherently sinful, sometimes they are. Sometimes they're lashing out at people. Sometimes it's if I get into a situation of binge eating because I'm unhappy, that's a problem. As much as pornography or drugs or alcohol is a problem. As much as being angry and trying to control things around us is a problem. It begins when there's a desire within us, and that desire is meant with the occasion that tempts us to act on the desire. And James lets us know, he lets everybody know, that if you're going to act on this, it will conceive, it will bear sin, and that sin will bring death. Sin never exists apart from death. And so even as Christians, it doesn't mean that we could lose our salvation, but it does mean that we can give up, we can forfeit the life that Jesus Christ offers, the fullness of it. And so it's just a caution. When we look at Micah, when we look at this Levite, when we look at the tribe of Danites, tribe of Dan, when we look at them as an example of how things can snowball out of control, and ultimately remember that it led that tribe and that people to death, it should be a reminder to us that these little things that may seem insignificant, these little choices to behave in ways that are incongruent with the grace and love of Jesus Christ, that brings death, whether it's a forfeiture of his blessing, or as the unsaved person, if you've never trusted Christ, then it does manifest itself in an everlasting death. And so that's where I want to land this morning. Jesus Christ created a ripple effect of righteousness, which is good news for us, great news for us. I was not capable of being righteous, and I was not capable of sharing in a relationship with God, my Creator, but because of Jesus Christ I am, as are you. In him we find a new way to be human, a deep and meaningful quality of life. So, there's two ways out of this morning, as we think about the ripple effects. So if you haven't trusted Jesus with your life yet, here's what I was thinking about. I want to challenge you to get to know him, and then decide if you believe he's worth trusting. And here's why I say it this way, because oftentimes we go and we tell people about Jesus, and we can even tell them our story and what he's done in our life, and some people will respond to that. We mentioned a few weeks ago the thief on the cross who in his final moments trusted Jesus. He knew very little. I bet you he knew more than we give him credit for. But what I'm saying is we go up to people and we expect them with a small note or with a word. We present Jesus to them, that somehow that's enough to validate their trust. That they would take just our word for it, which is great when it happens. But this morning, I'd like to challenge, if there's anybody here this morning, or maybe they're watching, or maybe it helps you in your approach to speaking with people who don't know Jesus yet, challenge them to get to know him first. That means you open up the Bible. They take the time to open up their Bibles and they begin reading in the Gospels. What did Jesus say, and how did he treat people, and what was he like? And when they're done, the challenge will be to them, like, now you can decide. Are you going to trust him or what? Is he trustworthy? So if you haven't trusted Jesus with your life yet, I challenge you to get to know him and then decide if you believe he's worth trusting. There's a number of us here who have, yeah? Amen. Now, for those of us who are trusting Jesus, it is an encouragement to continue to put to death the disordinate desires that tempt you and tempt me to find satisfaction through sin, because we are constantly putting the flesh to death. It doesn't stop until we're in his presence, until we exist in a glorified body. As long as we're in a flesh that's been hijacked by sin, we are called to put to death the deeds that we do in our body that offend God. It's an ongoing thing, but we have the righteousness of Christ. We have the power of the Holy Spirit. So it's a total possibility It's a probability. If we choose to trust him and choose to behave in different ways, we can continue to move out of the things that we do that are sinful. And again, just for clarity, if anybody's wondering, is he saying that we can become perfect or without sin? Because some churches believe that. I'm not saying that. I don't even think that's worth focusing on. What I think the focus is that Jesus said, I can call you out of this one temptation at a time. You can refuse to sin one time and then another time. And sometimes we're going to fall, right? But the call is there to live in the life that God has granted us and to fulfill the space that he wants us to fill as the church in the world, a space defined by righteousness and faith and grace. So we can choose to experience something utterly different, an everlasting life. In closing, I'll read you Galatians 2:20. It says, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. See, the ripple effect of Jesus' incarnation enables us to experience a whole new life. Yeah, there's a lot of evil in the world, and it's all connected. It all has a ripple effect. It all goes back to the garden and that first sin. But there's an alternative, right, in Jesus Christ. So I want to encourage you again. If you don't know Jesus, please consider him, look at him, learn about him, and decide if he's worth trusting. If you do, let's never stop putting to death the sin that wants to live in our flesh, right? And in that we'll find a whole new way of living, and it's a good way. Would you pray with me? Father, this morning has been yours. It will be yours. And the considerations that come out of the book of Judges are, they're depressing, if I'm honest. It's just failure, it's rejection, it's disobedience. And week after week, we've looked at this, and there doesn't seem to be any hope. Not in the book of Judges. We see the effects even hundreds of years later. God, not preached twice. I want to thank you for Jesus Christ. I want to thank you that there are people who trusted him, followed him as his disciples, who led others to him, all the way down to this now. Thank you for changing my life. Thank you for changing the lives of those here who have trusted you, and for not ever letting us go, not ever turning your back on us, always being faithful. And Father, as we move forward, there's just deeper life. I know you're calling us to it, and as you refine us and transform us, I just wanted to thank you for your grace, and thank you for your patience, and thank you that you give us power to refuse to give in to our disordinate desires. I wanted to ask, Father, you would continue to change our church and show us new ways how to live on a personal level, but also corporately, as we learn how to engage one another in relationships. We learn to reach out to others, to share the good news of Jesus Christ, that you would continue to bless us and show us how meaningful that is, so that the ripple effects of our own lives might echo that of Jesus, and that your kingdom would grow and others might receive you as their Savior. We ask for your blessing on that in particular. We ask that in Jesus' name. Amen. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, you can reach out to us through our webpage, bbcoxford.com. We'd love to be able to help you as best we can.